Welcome back to the program. So, on Full Throttle Thursday, yesterday, we discussed Cuba. And I said as soon as Venezuela fell, within a day or two, that within 2 years, I think the Cuban regime is going to fall. And I kind of stuck with that. And we talked a lot about it and we asked everybody what their thoughts were. Most people kind of agreed with my assessment. But then, of course, we talked about it because President Trump came out and said that he wants this regime gone by the end of this year. So the question now is, am I wrong? Is the president wrong? And could it actually be way sooner? Well, I hope I am wrong. I hope all of you are wrong, agreeing with me. And I hope that President Trump is wrong as well. And I hope that it's within weeks or even a few months. And you know what? It could be. And I say could because now we have some interference from the CCP. China has injected $80 million into the Cuban regime and sends thousands of tons of rice as the population remains trapped amid blackouts and shortages. China's communist regime has once again stepped in to prop up another communist regime, just like theirs, Castroism they're calling it. One of its most delicate moments, Chinese President Xi Jinping approved a new round of aid to Cuba that includes $80 million earmarked for the acquisition of electrical equipment and to cover other urgent needs that the country desperately needs right now, according to an official statement from the Cuban presidency. This financial support is accompanied by the shipment of 60,000 tons of rice as a donation presented to Havana as a gesture of solidarity in the face of the deep crisis that is crippling the island. The news comes at a time marked by constant blackouts, food shortages, and a rapidly deteriorating quality of life. Now, look, let me say first and foremost, we don't want the Cuban people themselves to be suffering. We don't want them to be starving. We don't want them to have a worse quality of life than they've already had to live through for the past 66 plus years in communism, right? And we don't want people to die and starve to death and everything else. So I understand why China is doing this. But if you're going to get rid of this regime, you might want to step up the resistance against the regime and, I don't know, maybe do a blockade of aid and resources and materials coming in. And if that happens, well, then the whole thing collapses pretty quick. You get the regime out, you get somebody in, you get them the food, you get them everything that they need. Because here's the thing. Do you think that the Cuban regime is going to give the people the rice and the food and the medical supplies? Of course not. They've treated them like dog shit for 66 plus years. Why would that change now? It wouldn't. So I wanted to point that out. So then it says the news comes, here we go, power outages, we know about that. Ordinary citizens, the aid announced from Beijing does not translate into immediate or even tangible relief. The Chinese Communist Party announced with a high-profile visit to Miguel Diaz-Canel, I guess he's the president or whatever, that they see the Cuban regime as an ally and comrades. This is what the Chinese Communist Party said. While the population, sadly, is facing darkness and scarcity, the regime prioritizes alliances with authoritarian powers focused on their security, their internal controls, and police cooperation. So exactly what I said. They're not going to give these starving people in Cuba this food and this aid. So why would we even allow China to continue to give them anything? It's not going to get to them anywhere. On the streets, the contrast is stark. Mothers cook with whatever they can find. Elderly residents climb dark stairwells due to non-functioning elevators. And some entrepreneurs are forced to close their businesses because they cannot endure entire workdays without electricity. International aid channeled through an opaque and highly centralized state fails to reach the communities that need it the most with the speed and transparency that they require. Decades of experience only deepens public distrust. Resources sent to the regime rarely make it to these neighborhoods that are in dire straits. Instead, they are absorbed by the power structure and diluted through bureaucracy, inefficiency, and corruption. The result is clear and visible: collapsed infrastructure, deficient transportation, and families surviving barely thanks to remittances from abroad. China is not acting out of altruism or care or even out of empathy. Each shipment strengthens its strategic influence in the Caribbean and consolidates Cuba as a political key ally in the area. For Beijing, the island is a geopolitical asset. For everyday Cubans, it is yet another promise that goes, sadly, unfulfilled. Well, here's why the timeline might actually be a lot different than what I have predicted and what President Trump has predicted. And again, he's the one with all the answers, and he can change the timelines. I can't. Listen to this. The Trump administration is seriously weighing a naval blockade to halt Cuban oil imports. Energy is the chokehold that will kill off this Cuban regime, said a person familiar with these discussions. The Trump administration is weighing new tactics to drive regime change in Cuba, including imposing a complete and total blockade on oil imports to the Caribbean country. 3 people familiar with the plan said on Thursday. That escalation has been sought by some critics of the Cuban government in the administration and backed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, according to 2 of the 3 people who were granted anonymity to discuss this sensitive information. No decision has been made yet on whether to approve that move, but it could be among the possibilities and actions presented to President Donald Trump to force the end of the Cuban Communist government once and for all. Preventing shipments of crude oil to the island would be a step up from Trump's statement last week that the U.S. would halt Cuba's imports of oil from Venezuela, which had been its main crude supplier. But there are ongoing debates within the administration about whether it is even necessary to even go that far, according to some people. The loss of Venezuelan oil shipments and the resale of some of those cargoes that Havana used to obtain foreign currency has already throttled Cuba's laggard economy. A total blockade of oil imports into Cuba could then spark a humanitarian crisis, a possibility that has led some in the administration to push back against. The discussion, though, however, shows that the extent to which people inside the Trump administration are considering deposing the Cuban leaders as they view them as adversaries. Energy is the chokehold to kill off the regime, said one person. Deposing the country's communist government in power since the Cuban Revolution of 1959 is 100% a 2026 goal, end quote. The effort would be justified under the 1994 Libertad Act, better known as the Helms-Burton Act. This law codifies the U.S. embargo on Cuban trade and financial transactions. Cuba's embassy in Washington did not respond to requests for comment. A White House spokesperson did not address a question on whether the administration was considering blocking all oil imports into Cuba. Cuba imports about 60% of its oil supply, according to the International Energy Agency. It was heavily dependent on Venezuela for those imports until the Trump administration started seizing sanctioned shipments from the country. Mexico has more recently been the main supplier as Venezuelan crude shipments have completely been shut down. Mexico, however, charges Cuba for imported oil, and its shipments are not expected to fully ameliorate Cuba's worsening energy shortage. Since the United States operation that captured Venezuela's leader, Nicolas Maduro, the administration has turned its attention now on Cuba, arguing that the island's economy is at its weakest point, making it ripe for regime change now. Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the son of Cuban immigrants, have each voiced their optimism that the island's communist government will fall in short time given the loss of Venezuela's economic support. Toppling the communist regime in Cuba would fulfill a nearly 7-decade political project for Cuban exiles in Miami who have pushed for democracy on the island since Fidel Castro took power after ousting the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista in 1959. Rubio has long been an advocate for tough measures against Havana in the hopes of securing the fall of the regime. Now, as I mentioned last night, there was an amendment, and it was called the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment, after the Spanish-American War, basically was put in place to allow the United States to have access, I guess, or oversight, if you will, on the government, on their constitution, on their military, everything having to do with Cuba. America had oversight over, and they were allowed to intervene at any point, okay? Now, this was all the way up until idiot FDR, Democrat president, the bad deal, all that crap. There was a good neighbors policy. And so what did he do? He repealed the Platt Amendment that was signed, I think, in 1898 or 1901. And what did that do? Well, it basically allowed for the eventual Cuban Revolution in 1959 because we no longer had the ability to step in militarily and say, this Cuban Castro guy, no, he's not taking power. We were stupid. And we gave that up. Thankfully, we weren't stupid enough to give up Guantanamo Bay. That is on a permanent, never-ending lease. That's why when Barack Obama comes in as president and within 2 days signs an executive order to shut it down, what are you, crazy? You can't shut Guantanamo Bay down. If you shut that down, number one, it kills the agreement that we would have. And now all of a sudden, you've got a military base that you're giving to communists. What are you, stupid? Well, of course you were stupid. That's why you did it. Thankfully, the Congress had enough brains not to listen to him and overrid him and basically pulled out the ending of Guantanamo Bay in one of the NADA laws or legislation that they did the year of his first presidency term or whatever it was. Anyway, long story short, this regime is at its end. And yes, honestly, knowing that the resources, the aid, the humanitarian needs, all of these things, the rice, the food, everything else is not going to be given to the people, why not just do a complete embargo, cut them off at the knees, put in giant tankers right around Cuba, leave them there. Anything that comes in, you seize it immediately. You shut this regime down so that they have to go in the next month or so. Are some people probably going to starve? Sadly, yeah. Yeah, sadly. But do you want the regime to continue on for the next 30, 40, 50 years being supplied by China and Mexico and other countries that believe in these communist regimes? No, you don't. So if we're going to save as many people as humanly possible, sadly, a few may have to be sacrificed in order to do so. So I hope President Trump does a full embargo, not just oil, everything. Aid, humanitarian aid, food, every single thing that goes into Cuba needs to be 100% seized and cut off. That's the only way you're going to starve out, literally, this regime. Those are my thoughts. What are yours? Put them down in the comments below. We'll see you in the next one.